It was Russia's largest mechanized assault of the fall. On October 27, 2025, approximately 29 armored vehicles began a push toward the Ukrainian villages of Shakhove and Volodymyrivka in what Moscow hoped would be a breakthrough operation. Beginning near the strategically vital city of Dobropilya in the Donetsk Oblast, Russian forces began to grind their way to the two villages in an assault that would take more than 6 hours. But instead of a hard-fought victory, the effort became yet another symbol of Russia's declining military effectiveness and strategic desperation. Here's how Russia's biggest autumn offensive turned into 6 hours of sheer hell with nothing to show for it at the end. The assault began in the early morning hours, Russian planners taking advantage of the dense fog and wet terrain in the hopes of hampering Ukrainian drone operations and limiting aerial detection. Russian commanders deployed their forces in an unconventional pattern, with small scattered groups of 4 or 5 vehicles, each advancing on a staggered schedule. Previously, as some Ukrainian commanders noted, this tactic was employed by Russia solely for infantry pushes rather than mechanized infantry and vehicle offensives. Apparently, Russia had decided to try something new and more adaptive in its offensives, befitting a relatively large attack. But Ukrainian defenders were ready. The 1st National Guard Corps Azov, alongside the Army's 33rd and 93rd separate mechanized brigades, had prepared extensively for assaults throughout the area, including for the possibility of a broader use of vehicles as frontline forces. Pre-positioned engineering obstacles, carefully placed minefields, and coordinated fire control zones turned the battlefield into a test of Russian armor. Ukrainian artillery units and drone operators seamlessly cooperated to systematically destroy vehicle after vehicle as Russian forces attempted to penetrate defensive lines. The results were catastrophic for Moscow. After more than 6 hours of sustained combat, not a single Russian unit achieved its objective. Ukrainian forces repelled the entire assault, inflicting some of the most significant daily losses to an army that is already hemorrhaging personnel and equipment at unsustainable rates. The 29 armored vehicles that represented Russia's autumn offensive power were either destroyed, damaged, or forced to retreat, with supporting infantry hunted down by Ukrainian FPV and bomber drones as they attempted to establish positions in the forest belts surrounding the target villages. Both Azov and the 33rd Mechanized posted videos on Telegram with clear images of drones dismantling Russian positions one by one. Some of the clips clearly show Russian tracks across the muddy fields while surrounded by Ukrainian drones. At many points, the drone footage cuts out suddenly, indicative of a successful detonation that damages the tank and throws shrapnel around the nearby area. Notably, most of the vehicles appear not to be tanks but infantry support vehicles, suggesting that Russia has been slowly running out of main battle tanks that served as the main invasion force in the war. The offensive wasn't an isolated incident, but just another indicator of how Russia seems to be losing all momentum throughout the year. Just 2 weeks earlier, on October 13th, Russian forces had attempted a similar assault in the same area, losing 9 infantry fighting vehicles, 4 MTLBs, 3 tanks, and 3 motorcycles. The fact that Russia returned to the same battlefield with slightly modified tactics speaks volumes about the rigid, inflexible nature of Russian military planning and the severe constraints now limiting their operational capabilities. While the small unit infiltration approach represented a change from earlier mass armor assaults, the execution demonstrated fundamental weaknesses in Russian combined arms operations. Russian forces increased their tank deployment for this operation, indicating a return to traditional armored warfare after months of costly infantry assaults. The vehicles used so-called anti-drone mesh, which is cage armor crudely welded onto tanks and infantry fighting vehicles in a desperate attempt to counter Ukraine's dominant drone superiority. While anti-drone netting or cages can slightly reduce a tank's susceptibility to drone operations, specifically from above, they proved largely ineffective against Ukrainian hunter-killer drone teams that have perfected their tactics over 3.5 years of combat. The Russian plan involved advancing in small groups along several routes to split Ukrainian defenses and allow follow-up forces to exploit any breakthroughs. In theory, this approach made sense. Rather than presenting a single massive target for Ukrainian artillery and drones, Russian commanders hoped that simultaneous attacks from different directions would overwhelm defenders and create confusion. But in practice, Ukrainian forces demonstrated exactly why this tactic was doomed from the start. The 33rd Separate Mechanized Brigade reported that they identified at least 6 Russian vehicles approaching Volodymyrivka in the morning, which was over 20% of the invading force. Using a combination of traditional optical surveillance and drone reconnaissance, Ukrainian forces could also practically track Russian movements from the moment they left their deployment areas. And when these same Russian vehicles attempted to drop infantry into forest belts on the village outskirts, They were immediately engaged by coordinated artillery fire and drone strikes. This tactical approach simply continued the pattern of losses that started in late August, when Ukraine started its own counteroffensive and retook more than a dozen villages in the area. To lower the hemorrhaging of troops, Russian forces previously relied on small unit infiltration tactics, with some reportedly managing to enter the city limits of Pokrovsk, which is considered a crucial target in the region. This new shift to mechanized small unit tactics by Russia, however, creates new problems, as shown in this attack. While deploying smaller units may make them less vulnerable to mass artillery strikes, it also means that each group lacked the combat power necessary to overwhelm prepared defensive positions. Ukrainian defenders could defeat each small assault individually, turning what was supposed to be simultaneous pressure from multiple directions into a series of isolated engagements. And under these new terms, Ukraine could have its pick of targets while Russian soldiers were still busy scrambling to find vantage positions in the middle of barren fields or forests under constant surveillance. But there's also one huge issue to unpack here. The attack had 29 vehicles and yet was considered a significant concentration of power by 2025 standards. This being the largest offensive of the season speaks volumes about how much Russian capabilities have fallen. For comparison, Russia's summer 2024 offensive around Pokrovsk regularly featured 2 assaults with 98 vehicles between September 12th and September 19th, supported by extensive artillery preparation and air support. A report echoed by Times Radio suggested losses of over 100 vehicles per week in the area a year before. So when the sight of only 29 vehicles qualifies as a major operation, and that modest force achieves practically nothing, it's safe to say that Russia seems to be running out of steam. The assault also highlighted Russia's continued inability to effectively integrate air power with ground operations. Despite Russia's supposed air superiority on paper, Ukrainian defenders reported minimal air support for the attacking forces. Russian fixed-wing aircraft remained largely absent from the battlefield, constrained by Ukraine's layered air defense network and the catastrophic losses Russia's air forces suffered over the 3.5 years of combat. The much-vaunted glide bomb attacks that caused such devastation in 2024 and were purportedly improved upon as late as August this year were notably absent this time round, suggesting either ammunition shortages, delivery system problems, or simply the recognition that Ukrainian air defenses around Dobropilya have become too formidable to risk valuable aircraft. Ukraine, meanwhile, funneled Russian forces into pre-planned kill zones. Minefields forced Russian vehicles into narrow corridors where they became easy targets for anti-tank guided missiles and FPV drones. Artillery fire was carefully coordinated to prevent Russian forces from consolidating or establishing fire support positions. And when Russian infantry dismounted from their vehicles, Ukrainian drone operators were waiting for those exact moments to strike, hunting individuals and small groups through forest belts with bomber drones and FPV systems. The result was a perfect defense. Not a single Russian unit succeeded in establishing a foothold in either Shakhove or Volodymyrivka. The assault culminated with a breakthrough without territorial gain and without any operational benefit to offset the heavy losses in personnel and equipment. Of course, this is unlikely to be the last attack in the area, and the frequency of these ineffective strategies might increase as the end of 2025 closes in. Russia keeps throwing forces at this sector despite repeated catastrophic failures because Pokrovsk has become one of the major strategic centers for Ukrainian defenses and unites the country's efforts in the region. Its fall would represent a strategic disaster that could reshape the war's trajectory, which is precisely what the Russians are hoping for. You see, Pokrovsk sits at the intersection of multiple critical supply highways and houses one of the most important railway hubs in eastern Ukraine. Every Ukrainian defensive position across a huge swathe of Donetsk Oblast depends on supplies that flow through Pokrovsk transportation network. Ammunition, fuel, reinforcements, medical supplies, food, and everything that keeps Ukrainian forces fighting in the east passes through this critical logistics node. If Russia were to capture Pokrovsk, it could open up the entire Donetsk front. Should the city fall into Russian hands, Ukrainian troops stationed further east would likely struggle with major supply shortages. Ukraine's ability to quickly reinforce threatened areas via road and rail networks would be lost, cutting off support. As a result, Ukrainian forces might have to retreat while fighting, leaving behind well-fortified positions that Russia fought hard to take. This loss would force Ukraine to create a new defensive line much further west, giving up hundreds of square miles not because of enemy attacks, but due to their inability to resupply. But there's more at stake than just military logistics. Pokrovsk's capture would advance Russian President Vladimir Putin's declared war aim of completely occupying Donetsk Oblast. It's Since the invasion began, Moscow has consistently framed its objectives in terms of liberating Ukraine from Western influences and fascist tendencies. When the broad target of the entirety of Ukraine failed to be captured, the Donbass region was assessed as a suitable fallback plan. The region was chosen due to a large concentration of Russian-speaking Ukrainians, with the oxymoron notwithstanding, which Russian propaganda spun as needing to be liberated from Ukrainian tyranny. Consequently, Russian plans turned to controlling the entire administrative boundaries of Donetsk and Luhansk. Currently, Russia controls only portions of Donetsk, and every map showing incomplete occupation is a daily reminder to Putin that his special military operation has failed to achieve even its most basic stated objectives. This creates immense political pressure within Russia's leadership. Putin has staked his regime's legitimacy on victory in Ukraine. He desperately needs something he can present to the Russian people as success. Full control of Donetsk would allow Russian propagandists to declare mission accomplished, to claim that Russia has achieved its goals of denazifying and demilitarizing the Donbass, regardless of the catastrophic price paid. The economic dimension is equally important. Donetsk Oblast, despite the devastation of war, still contains valuable industrial infrastructure, agricultural land, and mineral resources. The region historically produced coal, steel, and chemicals that were vital to Ukraine's economy. While much of this infrastructure has been damaged or destroyed, control of the territory would give Russia access to whatever remains and the potential to rebuild in the future. More importantly, denying these resources to Ukraine advances Russia's strategy of crippling Ukraine's economic base and long-term viability as an independent state. There's also a geopolitical calculation at work, because Russian military planners understand that time is not on their side. Every month the war continues is another month of economic decline for Russia, another month of casualties that can't be easily replaced, another month for Ukraine and President Volodymyr Zelensky to come up with new weapons or get donations from the increasingly confident NATO. Russian military leadership appears to believe that if they can capture Pokrovsk and complete the occupation of Donetsk before their offensive capabilities collapse entirely, they can force Ukraine into negotiations from a position of relative strength. This is supported by the fact that most of President Donald Trump's suggestions regarding the creation of a frozen conflict should be done along the current battle lines rather than forcing reparations or Russia's retreat. By getting complete control of the occupied part of Donetsk through a ceasefire agreement ratified by NATO, Putin could even potentially claim victory, secure the contested territorial gains, and avoid the domestic fallout stemming from a contracted economy and loss of confidence in his government. This explains why Russia continues to assault the Pokrovsk-Dobropilya corridor despite horrific losses. From the Kremlin's perspective, there is no acceptable alternative to continuing the attacks. Abandoning the offensive would mean admitting that Russia can't even achieve its reduced territorial objectives. Russian commanders likely even know that the attacks will fail and that they will lose most, if not all, units and equipment, or be forced to retreat limping and bleeding, figuratively or literally, until they can create another, largest autumn offensive a few weeks later. But they also know that Putin demands progress, that the political leadership expects Donetsk to fall, and that failure to make at least some forward momentum could have career or life-ending consequences for Russian military officers. Ukrainian defenders, for their part, understand exactly what they're fighting for. Pokrovsk has the ideal terrain to be defended via drones and artillery, composed mainly of open fields and farmland with little to no room to create makeshift fortifications or hiding spots. This is made even better in autumn or spring when rain or thaw creates more muddy terrain to slow down infantry and vehicle operations. The added military stations in Dobropilya allow the two settlements to effectively protect each other remotely. The existing road and rail infrastructure, meanwhile, permits a steady stream of supplies from the rest of the country. The terrain is suited to mechanized infantry, but natural bottlenecks near the city produce similar conditions as seen on the daily maps. While Pokrovsk has been encroached on from three sides, few offensives have actually made it closer than a few miles away from the city. Meanwhile, Ukraine's full control of the northwest is slowing Russia's momentum significantly. So long as the city itself stands, Ukraine can keep the incoming Russian forces under control, because as soon as Russians enter and capture the city entirely, those same conditions will make a Ukrainian counteroffensive that much more difficult to accomplish. The increase in Russian tank employment in this operation is a potentially significant tactical shift, however one that could spell trouble for either side of the conflict. Between October 20th and 25th, Russian forces conducted 41 armored vehicle-supported assaults across the entire front line, with a notable concentration of tank-led attacks in the Pokrovsk sector. This is a departure from the infantry-heavy meat wave tactics that dominated Russian operations throughout much of 2025, even though they technically bore fruit in June and July. On the surface, the switch to mechanized operations could appear to be a sign of Russian forces returning to more conventional combined arms tactics. Remember, while Russia lost a lot of tanks and people, it still likely has many more vehicles in storage and can pull from a much larger pool of recruits than Ukraine. But both of these require time, money, effort, and would reveal the exact extent of losses to the Russian public, none of which Russia really has or wants. In reality, this is likely among the final attempts to achieve meaningful territorial gains before Russian offensive capabilities collapse entirely or winter weather makes large-scale operations impossible. One reason for the push at this time is the sheer number of tanks that Russia can actually deploy to the front lines. According to some estimates, Russia can theoretically produce around 300 of its most advanced tanks in active service, the T-90M. A report by the Conflict Intelligence Team suggested that Russia has already run out of older T-90A chassis that were then upgraded to T-90M standards, and that most of the tanks currently being built were custom-made with new parts and technologies. Additionally, Jane's, an open-source defense intelligence outlet, has identified that T-90 and T-80 tanks have been significantly more present on the battlefield than they were in 2022. According to visual data, 23 units have the T-80 tank, while only 3 units used the model in 2022. For the T-90, only 2 units had the tank 3 years ago, and that number skyrocketed to 20. But despite wider adoption, Russia still seems hesitant to deploy tanks to the battlefield. Namely, most of the vehicles actually being used for offensives over the past few months aren't main battle tanks at all, but infantry support vehicles, which don't carry nearly as much offensive armament. On the other side, when Ukraine does seem to use its tanks, it uses T-72s, or even obsolete museum pieces, to provide cover and soak up artillery strikes to give infantry units time to strike. This stems from production not being able to keep up with demand, even with the increased production rate, which has been predicted to go over 1,000 tanks annually by 2029, Russia can't keep up with the losses. According to Oryx, Russia has been confirmed to have lost just over 4,200 tanks in 44 months, giving it a tank loss rate of over 1,130 per year. The production numbers simply can't cover the losses, but Russia still has plenty of tanks that are sitting in storage or undergoing repairs to be fit for the front. It's just a matter of whether Russia will prioritize short-term gains or long-term equipment recovery. Russian commanders have likely realized that their infantry-first tactics have stopped yielding the results necessary to keep up the momentum or even satisfy the domestic propaganda. So using tanks in a larger capacity is likely to be shown as renewed efforts to create crucial battlefield wins. If Russia does decide to dedicate more of its mechanized infantry resources to Pokrovsk, it could potentially overwhelm Ukrainian defenses. Additionally, the actual model of the tank or infantry support vehicle doesn't seem to make much of a difference when pitted against drone swarms, minefields, or combined Ukrainian tactics to divert available offensive routes to bottlenecks where armor becomes more of a hindrance than a solution. So Russia could theoretically use some of its older tanks to gain a short-term advantage, but there's also a darker interpretation. The increased use of armored forces in what might be Russia's final major push of 2025 could indicate that the Russian military and political leadership understand their window for offensive operations is rapidly closing. Every indicator suggests Russia's military is approaching a breaking point. While Russia has committed to making new tanks, it actually stopped producing the supposedly modern T-14 Armata and likely doesn't have many older tanks left to throw at the front line for cheap. Russian military exports have also dropped to insignificant levels, preventing the military-industrial complex from actually generating revenue and making it one of the biggest expenditures for Russian taxpayers to swallow. This comes at the same time as when Russia has been forced to lower its military budget for the first time in years and increase both personal and corporate taxes, suggesting an economy that's slowly being strangled of resources. If Russian leadership recognizes that reality, and there's considerable evidence they do, then the current offensive operations take on a different character. The new attack is part of a desperate race to capture as much territory as possible before Russian offensive capabilities degrade beyond the point where meaningful attacks are possible. Russian commanders may be operating under a timeline that gives them until the end of 2025 or perhaps early 2026 to secure territorial gains that could be translated into negotiating leverage. For Ukraine, these developments create both opportunity and danger. The opportunity lies in the recognition that Russia's desperate final push, if that's what this represents, can be defeated. Ukrainian forces have shown repeatedly that they can repel Russian assaults, even large ones, when properly supported and supplied. If Russia is indeed expending its last reserves of offensive power in pursuit of Pokrovsk and the completion of Donetsk's occupation, then defeating these attacks potentially ends Russia's ability to conduct any meaningful offensive operations, shifting the war into a new phase where Ukraine holds the initiative. The danger for Ukraine is that Russia might succeed. While Russia has been hemorrhaging resources, so has Ukraine, and its manpower crisis is similar, if not worse, than Russia's. Ukraine still needs continued Western military aid, particularly artillery ammunition, air defense systems, and the long-range strike weapons necessary to hit Russian logistics and staging areas. Without those supplies, even an inferior Russian military can potentially grind through Ukrainian defenses through sheer persistence, and if Russia decides to go all out, it might do so by channeling all of its military and even possibly smaller nuclear warheads to do so. A larger-scale attack or actual deployment of a tactical warhead could force Ukraine to completely abandon the prospect of defending Donbass, which means the next few months will be vital to the outcome of the war. It remains to be seen whether Ukraine can keep up the momentum of repelling Russian attacks. If it does, Russia's internal problems might force the war to an end without needing a ceasefire or peace agreement. The country will just combust by itself. Thanks for watching. To learn why Russia failed to win the war in its early stages and is now resorting to these measures, check out this video. And if you want to stay up to date with daily news on the war and global geopolitics, make sure to subscribe to The Military Show for daily videos.